Lecture 16, The Eclipse of the Goddess.
In this lecture, we come to the end of our little mini unit on goddesses. This time, we're going to move beyond the point where we've paused the last two lectures, in which the goddess had become a fertility deity whose union with a consort, generally a son lover who may later be incarnated as a king, we have traced in the last two lectures. The goddess from this point on is threatened in two different ways, one internally and one externally, and in the end, she's going to wind up turning over much of her power and authority to male sky gods. Mircea Eliade, in his book Patterns in Comparative Religion, traces the kind of development in religious consciousness that we've been tracing over the last lectures. As he points out, many early creator gods are associated with the sky. Ideas of height and on high and infinite space all have religious value. But the sky is also remote and detached and inaccessible, and many early myths have the creator god retreating to heaven. Sometimes he turns over the day-to-day operation of his creation to subordinates, and sometimes even has subordinates finish the job before he's done. In our course, we've had several myths in which we've had a chance to see how the sky god gets pushed into remoteness and gets detached from everyday life on Earth. In some places, the sun god replaced the sky god. In Egypt this happened, it happened in Peru, it happens in parts of Mexico. But most often, the sky god is replaced by what Eliade calls fecundators, that is, fertilizers, those who provide the sort of energy for fertility and food production. And this is especially the case after the agricultural revolution. At which point, this is the point at which the goddess becomes very important, and that's what we've been looking at the last couple of lectures. Her consort is either a mortal, or at least he's capable of dying, so that while she embodies the eternal principle of birth and growth and death, he passes through stages and then passes back into the mother from whom he had emerged in the first place. We can only guess at what might have happened next if these internal developments have been just allowed to go at their own pace, but that didn't happen. Agriculture didn't develop all at once in all places. For a long while, there were little tiny settled agricultural communities that were surrounded by nomads, or at least people who didn't have agriculture, who saw in those agricultural communities granaries that were full and herds of cattle that were just ripe for the plucking. In those raids, farmers were always at a disadvantage because they weren't fighters and they had to stay put since survival depended on the crops they had planted. The solution eventually was to take small communities and band them together into cities and then to protect themselves with defensive city walls. Living together in large numbers was a new experience in human history, and we looked at some of the fears associated with that when we looked at our alligators in the sewers, that urban myth in Lecture 1. It meant living in cities, new techniques had to be created, workforces had to be organized, irrigation had to become a kind of group or corporate effort. Storage of grain became a municipal rather than a family matter. And there were all kinds of new specializations, like there had to be governors and warriors. And farmers in this new kind of hierarchy became more or less serfs. And as all of these new developments were happening, new gods and goddesses kept springing up to supervise these new activities like writing or governing or fighting. Since most of those new jobs seem to have been held initially by men, pantheons expanded along male rather than female lines. All this had happened in Mesopotamia by about 3000 BCE and in India about the same time or perhaps a little bit later. And we can only guess at what might have happened next. Because what did happen next was an external event. Indo-European invaders overran India and Greece, and Semitic invaders overran Mesopotamia, and all of these invasions took history off in a 90-degree turn. The Semites came from the Syro-Arabian deserts. They were nomads, they were herding sheep and goats, but they had domesticated the camel. The Indo-Europeans came perhaps from the steppes of Russia, where they grazed cattle, but they had domesticated the horse, and they had also invented the spoked wheel and the military chariot. So when these people, these invaders, came into settled communities, they wreaked incredible havoc. The Indo-Europeans forced their way into Mesopotamia and into Anatolia and into lands stretching all the way to the Indus Valley. The Semites came into Canaan and Mesopotamia. All of these invaders were descendants of Paleolithic hunters, but by now they had become very skilled warriors with great technological advances over the people they were invading. They became the Hittites in Anatolia and Syria. They became the Mitanni and the Hurrians and the Kassites in Mesopotamia. They became the Achaeans and then the Dorians in Greece. They became the Aryans in the Indus Valley. And because of their technological superiority, they became the ruling class wherever they went. They took over. They became the upper class. In Mesopotamia, the Semite invaders became Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. The Hebrews, too, came from this group, and they, as we remember, first pushed out the Canaanites, and then they got, in their turn, overrun by the Assyrians. It was an incredible age of migration. People seem to have been moving all over the place, all of the time. And virtually all cultures west of China got overrun in the process. Jacob Bernowski, in his The Ascent of Man, compared these invasions to Germany invading Poland in 1939, where people armed only with sticks and stones and the occasional World War I rifle tried to hold back German tanks. It was a bloody and violent age. We know that there were over 300 cities sacked in Anatolia alone, one of which was Troy, and of course that became the subject for the famous epic poem, the Iliad. And the same story that we have in the siege of Troy happened all across Europe and the Middle East during this time. This is really more history than it is mythology, but there are lots of implications of what happened for the goddess. The invaders who came into these settled places brought with them meteorological supreme gods. Usually they were gods of thunder and lightning, and they were always male, and they were also always warriors. In the myths of the time, we can see then how male warrior gods moved into these territories and then usurped the goddess's authority. Sometimes the goddess was assimilated into the pantheon with a much reduced status from what she'd originally have. We saw this happen with Hera. And sometimes the goddess was simply defeated or destroyed. These invaders were the people who wrote the myths that have come down to us. And that's one of the reasons why, as we've mentioned a couple of times, in order to see glimpses of what the goddess culture might have been like, we have to read between the lines. We have to read the margins, to try to guess what is underneath the writing that we have now, to see what the goddess might have been like before this brutal takeover. We're not quite sure either why all of these peoples brought these meteorological warrior gods with them. It's been guessed that maybe the harsh conditions in which they lived gave these invaders the sense that nature is not friendly. It's always trying to kill us. And their rewriting of the myths broke a bond that perhaps had been true, it had been the case between the goddess and nature for thousands of years. In the goddess cultures, as we've seen, the goddess had given birth to all things in a metaphor of parturition. So all of creation was part of herself. It was the way a child is part of its mother. But the meteorological gods, these new ones, were transcendent. They lived outside of nature, and they didn't give birth to the world, rather they made it. And the world that they made, therefore, exists apart from them in a way that couldn't be true of the goddess. So nature, from here on out, is something apart from the Creator, something perhaps more to be exploited than cherished. At least it's no longer the case that nature itself is divine because it issues from the goddess herself. The difference in these two attitudes between giving birth to and making is just beautifully captured in a quotation from an anonymous Abyssinian woman that was collected by Leo Frobenius at the beginning of last century. In talking about the differences between men and women, she says this: "How can a man know what a woman is? The life of a woman is completely different from that of a man. God has made it so. A man is the same from the time of his circumcision to his old age. He is the same before he has been with a woman for the first time and afterwards. The day that a woman first sleeps with her love cuts her life in two. A woman from that day on is a different person. A man after his first love is the same as he was before. A woman is from the day of her first love totally changed. This continues through all of life. A man spends a night with a woman and leaves. His life and body are the same as before. The woman conceives. As a mother, she is a different person from the woman without a child. She carries the consequences of that night for 9 months in her body. Something awakes. Something awakes in her life that will never go away. She is a mother. She is and remains a mother even if her child dies, even if all her children die. For once she carried the child under her heart. But even after the child is born, she carries it in her heart, and it never goes out of her heart again, not even when the child is dead. All of this a man knows nothing about. He knows nothing. This turns out, I think, to be a very poignant way of expressing the difference between giving birth to on the one hand and making on the other. In a series of myths, we can see the beginnings, the first challenges that male gods make to the ancient power of the goddess. And most of these are the result of internal developments, things that may have happened even without the invasions. We'll take a look at 3 myths here, which simply suggest the ways in which female goddess power and authority gets challenged by males. In all 3 of these cases, the goddess will survive the challenge, but the challenges are real enough and we can see them as signs of things to come. The first one is from the Dahomey people in Africa. In this one, the great mother Mawu creates the world and then retires to heaven. The people she's created begin to fight among themselves. They forget that each one of them has part of her in them, that each one is sacred, is divine in some kind of way. They're not treating each other as though they're specks or flecks of the goddess. And so she eventually sends down her children and her grandchildren, her daughters and granddaughters, to remind people that they are partly divine and they should not treat one another this way. There, when the daughters and granddaughters arrive, they run into a braggart, a character named Awe. Awe has taken advantage of the kind of freedom that Mawu has given people to aggrandize himself until he's beginning to believe that he is about as powerful as the goddess herself. And in fact, at some point he does declare that and decides that he will climb to heaven and challenge her to a contest to see who's really the stronger. The contest involves the making of human beings, and of course Awe fails. He gets partway along the job, but he can't finish it off the way she can. So he says he's contrite. He says he'll go back to Earth and tell everybody that she's still in charge and remind everyone that she is still the goddess. But she knows he's a charlatan and a deceiver, and she doesn't trust him. And so before he goes back home, she feeds him a bowl of cereal which contains the seed of death. And according to the story, that's how death comes into the world. We can see in this story that the goddess survives the challenge, but the challenge is a real one nevertheless. There's a very similar story from Greece. This is a creation story involving Eurynome. In one story, she's the first to emerge out of chaos, and she creates a serpent, Orpheon, who then watches her dance on the waves and is overcome with lust for her. He wraps himself around her arms and legs, and he makes love to her. When she knows that she's pregnant, she changes herself into a dove, lays the egg, out of which the universe itself will emerge. She has Orpheon wrap himself around this egg to incubate it, keep it warm, and when it hatches, everything in the world slides out of it. Orpheon, like Awe, as soon as the world is created, takes credit for the creation of the world. And so what she has to do is she has to kick him out of their mountain retreat into the depths of the sea. She finishes creation by making the first 2 human beings. Again, she wins, but the challenge from the male here, again, is very real. Our third story, a very similar one, is from Japan. This is the story of Amaterasu, who is the goddess of the sun, and her brother, Susanoo, who's the god of storms. When his father stations him, gives Susanoo his station, Susanoo is so enraged, he doesn't like the job he's been given, that he fights back, and his father eventually banishes him to the underworld. Before he goes to the underworld, he goes to see his sister in heaven and to say goodbye to her before he leaves. And while he's there, he wreaks great havoc in heaven. Susanoo we'll run across again because he's a trickster, and so we'll run across him again in our fourth unit. But for the time being, what he does is he wreaks a lot of destruction in heaven, including in some versions of the story, even killing one of his sister's maids. She is so overwhelmed by this brother of hers who's come in and wrecked everything that she retreats into a cave and promises never, ever to come out again. Now, she's the goddess of the sun, remember? So if she retreats into a cave, the earth grows dark, plants stop growing, people are in danger of dying, everything, chaos is about to return to the world. So the gods hold a council, and they come up with a plan. What are we going to do about this? What they do is they go to her cave, and outside the cave they have a gathering of gods, and then they get the goddess of dawn to do a very lascivious dance in which she actually bares her genitals and her breasts. The other gods roar with laughter when this happens. It's a comic dance, and Amaterasu inside her cave is kind of overwhelmed with curiosity. What are they laughing at? What's so funny about all of this? So she peeks out of her cave, and when she peeks out of her cave, they have hung a mirror so that she sees a reflection of herself, and she gets intrigued enough to take a step or two out of the cave to look at herself in the mirror, and as soon as she steps out of the cave, the other gods block it up so that she can't return. There's a lot more to this story, and we will get back to this story when we talk about tricksters in the fourth unit. But again, we can see that all of these myths show challenges of the goddess by a male. Again, the goddess wins, but she won't always. Leeming and Page, whose general structure we've been following here, call the fourth chapter of their book The Undermining of the Archetype, the Goddess Abused. And here are stories in which the goddess does not survive the challenge to her power, but actually yields a great deal of it up to males. They have 8 myths in their book. We'll look at 3 of them and then add one of our own that we've visited before to show you what these myths look like. The first one is one that we already know. This is back from lecture 4. It's the one about Marduk and Tiamat, which comes from the Enuma Elish. Marduk kills Tiamat and then takes her body apart and fashions the universe from it. We remember this. And then he finishes off creation by making the sun and the moon and the stars and finally human beings. Prior to that, everything had to be generated out of Tiamat herself in a birth process. As the Abyssinian woman quoted earlier says, something that is born from a woman will always be a part of her. Marduk doesn't give birth to, he makes creation as something apart from himself, as a work of art may be from the artist who makes it. He's not giving birth, but he makes the heaven and the earth. That means that from here on out, there's going to be a bigger gap between the creator and creation. And in that gap comes some of the binary oppositions between, for example, spirit, which is identified with God, and nature, which now have some separation between them that we didn't have before. They can't be separated in the goddess myths, but they can when the creator is male, when he doesn't give birth to. As these stories develop, he becomes transcendent and spiritual and divine. Creation, on the other hand, becomes substantive, material, lesser in value than he is. By the time of the Enuma Elish, Marduk represents all the powers of creation, and Tiamat has been turned into a monster. She is the power of destruction, and Marduk has to vanquish her and then take her place as a creator. In the vegetation myths that we looked at a couple of lectures ago, the mother sacrifices her son so that the land will be fertile. Here, the creator god sacrifices his mother, what technically Tiamat is his great-great-great-grandmother, but sacrifices his mother to create a world which is separate from himself. To complete this inversion, we remember that humans are created out of the blood of Tiamat's son lover. Marduk then becomes associated with nature, with light, with order, with goodness. Tiamat becomes associated with nature, with darkness, with chaos. He with mind, she with body. And that's a binary opposition that's plagued us through all of history. It's only a step from here, from this point, to the point at which history finally settled, understanding these stereotypical things that we've been plagued by for centuries. That is, that the feminine is chaotic, is material, is destructive, is demonic, and must be mastered by superior male forces, which are understood as orderly, rational, constructive. And the idea that the male represents the rational, the intellectual, the enlightened, while the female, on the other hand, represents the irrational, the emotional, the instinctive, the intuitive. All of this emerges out of this moment, this moment when Marduk takes apart Tiamat and then makes the cosmos out of her. It's a complete reversal of the values of maybe 25,000 years of human history. And the results seem to have included centuries that we've lived through ever since that time, centuries of ecological exploitation and psychic dislocation. When scholars in the 60s and 70s and beyond tried to awaken us to the possibility that there are other ways to see our relationship to this planet, to the gods, and to each other, they drew on this admittedly hypothetical reconstruction of what life might have been like in the age of the goddess. And that's what we've been trying to do in our last 4 lectures. There's another myth in Lemming and Page, and this one is another Japanese myth, which again shows the male taking over a lot of the female perks. This one, there is a couple, Izanagi and his sister Izanami, who are sent to Earth as the first human beings. They realize that they're expected to mate and to procreate, but they don't know how to do it. They've had no experience. Nobody's given them a manual to see how to do this. When they finally meet, they compare the bodies with each other, and he seems to have an excess in a place where she seems to have a deficiency, and they thought, well, maybe we can do something with that. But before they couple for the first time, they take a walk around the island in opposite directions. When they meet, coming toward one another, she says, "Oh, what a handsome man," and he says, "Oh, what a beautiful woman." Then they couple, and according to some versions of the story, their first offspring is so badly deformed that they eventually have to discard it. They have to put it in a boat and send it out to sea. What they realize, what they have done, the reason why the child turns out so badly is they have committed a ritual fault because she spoke first. When they meet, he is the one who's supposed to say first, "Oh, what a beautiful woman." Then she says, "Oh, what a beautiful man." So they do it again. They repeat the thing. This time they say it in the right order. And when they say it in the right order, then the child turns out all right. In more benign versions of the story, they catch their ritual fault before they've actually had the deformed child, and then they just walk around again. Then they couple, and everything turns out all right. As from here on out, once they get started with this process, Izanami gives birth to islands and gods and goddesses, producing the way goddesses do, and all seems well. But in giving birth to the god of fire, she's so badly burned that she dies. Izanagi misses her, and so he goes to the underworld to see if he can get her back. When he gets there, she's shrouded in darkness, so he can't see her. She eventually says she thinks she'll ask for permission to come back with him, but only if he will promise not to look at her. But he can't stand not seeing her, so he lights a tooth from his comb to make a torch, and then he sees his wife rotting and maggot-ridden. He is terrified. He runs to the entrance of the cave. The wife sends a pack of demons after him. He reaches the entrance, blocks off the entrance, and then ceremonially divorces his wife. Then he purifies himself in a bath, and in the process, in purifying himself in this bath, he creates a whole new batch of deities from his clothing and the grime washed from his body. He creates by himself a whole new batch of gods. Doesn't need female participation at all anymore. One of the goddesses produced in this bathing is Amaterasu, who comes from his left eye, and Susanoo, who comes from his nose, and their story takes off from here. But the important point for us is the male is here taken over the function of creation, not even needing a female help. Our next example isn't from Lemming and Page, but it illustrates the way in which the goddess gets downgraded in this process, in the same way that we saw Tiamat get downgraded. This one's from China, and it concerns a goddess that we've encountered before in Lecture 10. This is Nu Kua, the one who repairs the sky pillars and ushers in the Golden Age. She seems initially to have been a creator goddess, and there's a story about her creating humans by patting yellow clay into shapes. She gets tired of doing this and eventually drags a string through the mud. You remember this story? And the flecks that fly off become more human beings. In some versions, the handcrafted ones become aristocrats and the others become commoners, and this is one of those functional values of myths that we've talked about. In the myths that we've looked at, other myths we've looked at in Lecture 10, New Kua is still a savior and a culture hero. But over time, she gets downgraded. First, she becomes simply a consort of Fu Shi. Both are depicted as human down to the waist, but serpents from there on with their tails entwined. As Anne Birrell says about this stage in her development, she says, over time, the primordial and independent goddess of cosmogonic myth is domesticated by Han mythographers and made to serve as the exemplar of the human institution of marriage. She becomes, in fact, the subordinate half of the pair, just as Hera became subordinate to Zeus. And then the last stage of her downgrading happens when she becomes simply a mortal woman. She and her brother are once again, as with Izanami and Izanagi, with her brother are expected to procreate, but they're both embarrassed to do so because they are brother and sister after all. So they ask the gods for a sign. They say, would it be okay if we mated? The gods give them the sign. They go ahead and couple to start producing offspring. But they're still both embarrassed. They're so embarrassed that each one of them makes a fan so that he and she can cover their faces when they make love the first time. This is in part then an etiological myth because it explains why at traditional Chinese weddings the bride and groom both still carry fans. But from our point of view, it shows a goddess being marginalized, being made subordinate to her male counterparts. Anne Birrell again on this stage of New Kua says, the author has eliminated the two main functions of the goddess and has humanized her, relegating her to a conventionally subordinate female role and diminishing her own divinity and mythic power by making her prey to a higher god. Another story of females losing their power to males. Our last example of the subordination of a goddess comes from Homer's Iliad. Hera at one time may have been a most powerful and important Greek deity, judging by the number and size of temples to her that have survived. But after the Indo-European invasion, she became simply the wife of Zeus, and a jealous and shrewish one at that, taking savage revenge on any female, mortal or immortal, with whom Zeus had had a fling. In the Iliad, we get to actually witness a sexual encounter between Zeus and Hera. Hera favors the Achaeans in the Trojan War, and Zeus, for the time being, is supporting the Trojans. So what she wants to do is the Trojans are winning as a consequence. Hera wants to figure out some way of helping the Achaeans. And the plan she settles on is that she thinks if she can seduce Zeus, like all men, he will fall asleep immediately after sex. And then while he's sleeping, the gods that favor the Achaeans can come in and help the Achaean side without fear of punishment. Aphrodite helps her by making her absolutely irresistible. And then she strolls by Zeus, and Zeus says, oh my goodness, I have never wanted anybody as much as I want you. And to make his point, he makes a long, long list of all the other women he's wanted, and he wants her more than that. It's a pretty crass proceeding, which most men probably wouldn't get by with, but he's the king of the gods, and she wants to seduce him anyway. That's the whole point of this. So the idea is to get him somewhere and get him to fall asleep so that her side the gods can help the Achaeans. They wind up making love on a mountaintop. And it's a mountaintop that Zeus covers with flowers, and he brings down a golden cloud to cover them. And the scene is half comic and half beautiful. But our point again here is that by this time, sex has nothing to do with fertility or trying to repair the divisions of creation. Rather, now it's become a weapon in the gender wars, one that females now have to rely on once the goddess has given way to male sky gods and her power has been reduced to that of beauty and sexuality. Well, there are a lot of implications for this, but let me just mention a couple of them to end this. For Carl Jung and most Jungians, and I suspect most people for the last 3/4 of a century, the suppression of the goddess marks a positive step in human development. Jung himself, in a book called Symbols of Transformation, said that in order to free itself from the primal power of the mother, which he identifies with the unconscious, the paternal principle or consciousness has to perform what he calls a metaphoric matricide, has to kill the mother to free the consciousness for further development. That is, the growth of consciousness allows us to transcend instinctual and unconscious patterns, to rise out of nature and to become individualized, able to challenge the tribal visions and find our own ways as individual heroes. So for him, the suppression of the goddess is an important step in human evolution. In the past 40 years or so, others are less sanguine about this shift. We no longer, after this shift in consciousness, we no longer feel ourselves children of the mother, but of the father. Nature is no longer experienced as a source, but as an adversary, something to be exploited and conquered. Even time changes after this shift. Time in the goddess world is cyclical, always returning, starting out from the womb and going back to that same womb as a tomb to be reborn again. But the world of the sky gods is linear, and when we wear out, we're dropped into a kind of cosmic trash bin, which is perhaps why, after this shift, so many mystery religions sprang up all over the world, promising a life after death, and most of them centering on some manifestation of the goddess. Next time, we will change our focus from goddesses to gods, and we'll start with the biography of God in myth in the same way we've done with the goddess in the last four. That's next time.